Today I want to tell you 3 stories, and each one is tied to a single, deeply unsettling photograph. Every story has its own image, and at the end of each one, you will see that photo for yourself. Some of these images are so shocking that they stay with you long after you see them. But before we dive into these stories, if you're drawn to strange, dark, and mysterious events told as immersive narratives, then you're exactly where you should be. That's all that happens here. So if that sounds like something you enjoy, do me a favor. Invite the like button over to your house for an elegant dinner party. But when it arrives, don't open the door. Just leave it outside, humiliated and confused. Now let's begin. On the morning of October 21st, 1990, a 30-year-old man named Lee Honsho set out on a hike with 3 of his friends. Their destination was Butte Mountain, located in northern Taiwan. By the time this part of the story begins, the group had already been hiking for several hours, and the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. Lee's legs were on fire. Every step felt heavier than the last. But despite the pain, all 4 of them pushed forward until they finally reached the top of a jagged, rocky ridge. They stopped there for a moment, standing still, breathing hard, letting their bodies recover. Lee worked as a bank manager in his daily life, but outside of work, he was passionate about the outdoors. This hike up Butte Mountain had been on his list for a long time. Among hikers in Taiwan, completing this trail was seen as a kind of rite of passage. On average, the round trip took nearly 8 hours, and the terrain was notoriously unforgiving. Because of that, the hike was considered one of the most difficult in the entire country. And yet, despite its reputation, it was also a very popular tourist attraction, usually crowded with people attempting the climb. But on this day, something felt off. For reasons no one could explain, Lee and his friends hadn't seen a single other person on the trail. Not one. The weather was perfect. It was a weekend. There was absolutely no logical reason for the mountain to be empty, and yet somehow it belonged entirely to them. Standing on the ridge, they drank some water, ate a few snacks, and soaked in the silence. But they didn't linger long, because this wasn't the summit yet. The view was stunning, but the hardest part of the climb still waited above them. So they pressed on, energized by excitement and anticipation, steadily making their way higher. This was the moment they had all been looking forward to. Eventually, they reached one of the most famous sections of the mountain, a near vertical stretch that tourists talked about long after their visit. The only way to get past it was by using a rope that had been anchored directly into the rock face. Hikers had to grip the rope tightly and pull themselves upward, step by step. It was dangerous, exhausting, and thrilling all at once. And when the group arrived there, they knew they wanted proof that they had conquered it. One after another, each man climbed onto the rope, paused partway up, turned back toward the camera, and captured a photo of himself, battling that brutal section of the mountain. After everyone had their picture, they continued climbing, hand over hand, until they cleared the rope entirely and carried on toward the summit above. Once they finally reached the summit, the group didn't stay there for very long. A full trip up and back down the mountain usually took close to 8 hours, and that meant time was working against them. Darkness was coming, and they all knew they needed to start heading down before the sun disappeared behind the horizon. They stayed just long enough to snap a few photos and to really take in something that felt deeply unsettling. There was no one else there, not in the distance, not approaching from another trail. No voices, no movement, just the 4 of them standing at the top. It felt surreal. This was a breathtaking, well-known destination, normally packed with hikers, and yet, somehow, it was completely empty. Still, they didn't dwell on it. They got their pictures, admired the view, drank more water, ate a few snacks, and then began their descent. On the way up, they had stayed tightly together, moving as a unit, carefully navigating each section of the trail side by side. But on the way down, that changed. Lee was exhausted. The climb had drained him, and his pace slowed more and more with every step. Eventually, he told the others to keep going. He assured them that the route was clear, that everyone knew where the trail led, and that they could all meet back at the car. Reluctantly, his friends moved ahead, gradually increasing the distance between them and Lee. After a couple of hours of descending separately, the friends in front stopped. They realized they had been moving fast, almost rushing down the mountain. Thinking back to how tired Lee had been at the summit, they decided it made more sense to wait and let him catch up so they could finish the hike together. As they stood there, the same strange feeling returned. The mountain was still empty. No hikers passing them on the way up. No one coming down behind them. Just silence. They kept looking back up the trail, expecting Lee to appear at any moment, but he never did. Finally, one of them spoke up. He suggested the others stay put while he climbed back up the trail to find Lee and walk down with him. He was sure Lee was simply worn out and needed help finishing the last stretch. So he turned around and started hiking back uphill, fully expecting to run into Lee at any second. There were a few branching paths along the way down, and while it was possible to take a wrong turn, the trail was mostly straightforward. Still, as he climbed higher and higher, Lee was nowhere to be seen. After nearly an hour of hiking back up the mountain, with daylight fading fast, the friend made a difficult decision. He realized he couldn't keep going. Night was approaching, and it no longer made sense to continue searching alone. He convinced himself that Lee must have accidentally taken a different path and was likely already ahead of them, maybe even waiting at the car. So he turned back, rejoined the others, and together they made their way down the rest of the trail. When they finally reached the parking area, they scanned the lot, fully expecting to see Lee there, but he wasn't. By that point, the sun had almost completely disappeared. Darkness was settling in, and the realization hit all at once. Something was very wrong. Lee hadn't simply wandered off and found another way down. He was still somewhere on the mountain, and now it was nearly nightfall. There was nothing they could safely do. Searching for him in the dark would only make things worse. With no other options, they got into their car and drove to the nearest police station to report that their friend was missing and still up on the mountain. What followed was a massive search effort. Over the next week, teams of people combed the mountain, spreading out across the trails, scanning the terrain, calling Lee's name, hoping for any sign of him. But day after day passed with no results. Eventually, after an entire week of searching, the authorities were forced to call it off. Lee's friends and family were left with nothing but questions. Where had he gone? What had happened to him? The uncertainty was unbearable. In many ways, not knowing was worse than receiving the worst possible news. No one knew how they were supposed to feel. Do you grieve someone who might still be alive, or do you cling to hope and refuse to accept the possibility that he's gone? They chose hope. Weeks passed. Then weeks became months. And after 4 long months, something finally happened. A group of hikers climbing the mountain decided to deliberately step off the main trail. While moving through the terrain away from the path, they discovered Lee's body. The news devastated his loved ones, but at least it seemed like they would finally get answers about what had happened to him. Instead, the mystery only deepened. When police began investigating the cause of Lee's death, they encountered a series of disturbing inconsistencies. First, the autopsy revealed no clear cause of death. There was nothing definitive that explained why he had died. Second, the way he was found made no sense. Lee was sitting upright with his back resting against the mountainside. His backpack was placed right beside him. It looked as though he had simply sat down to rest and never stood back up. There were no obvious injuries, no signs of a fall, no visible trauma of any kind. This was especially confusing because Lee was an experienced hiker. He wasn't unprepared. He had supplies in his pack that could have sustained him. He carried a flashlight. He had a compass. He knew exactly which direction would lead him back to the car. So why would he stop there? Why sit down and never move again, with no injuries and no explanation? None of it added up. And then the story took a deeply unsettling turn. One of the friends who had been on the hike with Lee, the same friend who had brought the camera and photographed the rope climb, and the summit went to have the film developed shortly after Lee's body was discovered. As he looked through the photographs from that day, something stopped him cold. One image in particular made no sense. It was the photo of Lee posing on the rope. And at the very top of the frame, partially hidden by the rock face, there was someone else. A figure standing above them, looking down. But that was impossible. They hadn't seen anyone else on the mountain the entire day. And yet, there she was. A figure that appeared to be a young girl wearing a red jacket, standing exactly where none of them remembered seeing anyone at all. They would have noticed her. They would have spoken to her. But they hadn't. She appeared in Lee's photo only, and in none of the others. What made this even more disturbing was the fact that the figure appeared in only one photograph. She was present in Lee's image and nowhere else, and that detail connected to something far more unsettling. There had long been a local legend tied to this mountain, a story passed between hikers about spirits said to roam these slopes. According to the myth, these entities would single out certain people, lure them away from their companions, draw them off the trail, and lead them to their deaths. And when you looked at what happened to Lee, it was hard not to notice the similarities. After that photograph captured a girl in red standing above him, watching, Lee somehow became separated from his friends, wandered off alone, sat down on the mountain, and died without explanation. Whether coincidence or something far darker, no one could say for sure. But from that moment on, Lee's story stopped being just a tragic hiking accident and became something much harder to explain. Now, we move to a completely different place, thousands of miles away, deep in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. On the morning of August 8, 2024, a 48-year-old woman from Russia named Ludma Lazareno sat on the wooden floor of a small bungalow hidden beneath the jungle canopy in Peru. The structure was simple, used mostly for sleeping, and connected to a shared kitchen and dining area just a few steps away. Ludma sat cross-legged in the center of the room with her eyes closed, trying to meditate. But the rainforest refused to be quiet. Birds cried out from the trees. Insects buzzed constantly, and from the adjoining space, she could hear her friend moving around, the soft clatter of cups and the faint sound of water heating. Eventually, she gave up. She opened her eyes and looked toward the kitchen where her friend Ivan Kuzmin, a 38-year-old man from Ukraine, was busy preparing tea. Ludma and Ivan were close, but only as friends. Their relationship was entirely platonic. Ludma was married and had 2 children back home. She was here alone, not to escape her family, but to find something she felt she was missing. Ludma and Ivan were part of a larger retreat taking place deep in the Amazon rainforest. People from all over the world had traveled there with the same goal: to disconnect from their normal lives, meditate in nature, search inward, and hopefully return home with a new sense of clarity and perspective. Ludma and Ivan were no strangers to this kind of experience. For nearly 2 years, they had been attending retreats like this regularly. In fact, that was how they had met. They bonded over a shared interest in these journeys, but nothing more than that. They were simply friends, drawn together by the same desire to step away from everyday life. But there was one specific element of these retreats that truly pulled them into the rainforest. They weren't there just to sit quietly among the trees and hope for insight. These were ayahuasca retreats. During these ceremonies, participants were guided through a ritual where they drank a powerful, carefully prepared tea. The effects varied from person to person, but many believed it opened the door to an intense spiritual journey. People described confronting buried trauma, reliving painful memories, or seeing their lives from an entirely new perspective. Some claimed the experience changed them forever. For those struggling with emotional pain, unresolved trauma, or even wounds they didn't realize they carried, these retreats were said to be deeply transformative. Back home, Ludma lived an ordinary, busy life. She was a wife, a mother, constantly pulled in different directions by responsibility. For her, these retreats felt like a reset button, a rare chance to disconnect from expectations, noise, and pressure, and simply exist in peace. Ivan felt much the same. He came for his own reasons, searching for clarity and relief from the weight of his own life. And now, Here they were together, deep in the rainforest, inside a quiet bungalow, preparing for another journey inward. But they were about to make a critical mistake. The man who ran this retreat had made one rule absolutely clear to everyone who attended. No matter how experienced you were, no matter how many ceremonies you had been through before, you were never to drink ayahuasca without a shaman present. Never. The shaman's role wasn't symbolic. It was about safety. Someone had to be there to guide the experience, to intervene if something went wrong. Without that guidance, no one could predict what might happen. Everyone knew this rule. And yet, Ludma and Ivan convinced themselves it didn't apply to them. They had done this before, many times. They believed they understood what they were doing, so they decided to prepare the tea themselves, remain inside their bungalow, and drink it privately. No one would notice. No one would interfere. Ivan prepared the ayahuasca in the kitchen. When it was ready, he poured the tea into 2 mugs and carried them back into the bungalow. He sat down beside Ludma. Together, they drank. Then they lay down on the floor, closed their eyes, and waited for the effects to begin. A few hours later, the director of the retreat was leading a group meditation not far from the bungalows. The atmosphere was calm and quiet. Then he heard a scream. It came from somewhere nearby, close to the living quarters. And without hesitation, he stood up and ran toward the sound. He left the group without saying a word and ran toward the sound. When he arrived, he saw one of his staff members standing frozen in place, staring into a nearby bungalow. She was the one who had screamed. The director rushed to her side and looked inside. And the moment he did, he understood 2 things instantly. First, Ivan and Ludma had broken the most important rule. They had consumed ayahuasca without a shaman present. Second, the consequences were catastrophic. Ayahuasca is not a harmless herbal drink. It is an extremely powerful hallucinogen, and that power is the entire reason people travel to the rainforest to take it. Participants seek perspective they believe can only be reached by altering consciousness so deeply that reality itself begins to bend. People describe these experiences as leaving their bodies, observing themselves from the outside, confronting truths they had buried for years, and emerging from what is called a trip with the feeling that they finally understand who they truly are. But this is also exactly why a shaman must always be present. Not for ceremony, but for survival. Sometimes ayahuasca produces what is known as a bad trip. Instead of insight, the person is flooded with terrifying hallucinations that feel completely real. There is no way to separate illusion from reality. The person believes they are in immediate danger or that someone else is, and in that state, they feel compelled to act. The shaman exists to intervene, to ground the person, to stop them from hurting themselves or others. Ivan and Ludma had no such protection. When the effects took hold, Ludma's experience was calm. Ivan's was not. He descended into terror. In his hallucination, he became convinced that Ludma had been overtaken by evil spirits and that her soul needed to be saved. And in his fractured state of mind, he believed there was only one way to do that. Ivan grabbed a metal bottle and attacked her with it, beating her brutally. Then he went to the communal kitchen, took a knife, and returned. What followed was unspeakable. When the staff member looked inside the bungalow, she saw Ivan staring back at her. He was smiling. His eyes were unfocused. He was still fully under the influence of the drug, and scattered throughout the room were pieces of Ludma's body. A photograph was taken of Ivan shortly after this moment. In the image, he is sitting on the floor of the bungalow, only feet away from what remains of Ludma. He had just committed an act of extreme violence, and he was still trapped inside his hallucination. His expression is vacant, almost unreal. Eventually, the effects of the ayahuasca wore off. When Ivan returned to his senses, he immediately confessed to what he had done. He was arrested and charged with murder. He is currently serving his sentence in a prison in Peru. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon on August 20th, 1975, an 18-year-old young man named Michael McQuillan was hiking up a massive slab of granite known as Morro Rock, located inside Sequoia National Park in California. Hiking with him were his younger siblings, his 12-year-old brother Sean and his 15-year-old sister Mary, but at this point on the trail, Michael was well ahead of them. He could tell immediately why. They were exhausted. The hike to the summit of Morro Rock was only about a quarter of a mile in length, which didn't sound like much. But the trail was brutally steep. Despite his age, Michael was already a very experienced climber. Not long before this hike, he had completed a solo trek of 200 miles through the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Compared to that, this climb felt easy to him. But he knew his siblings weren't seasoned hikers. They weren't pretending to be either. So Michael slowed down and decided to wait, giving them time to catch up. As he stood there, something began to feel wrong. The sky above was darkening rapidly. Michael had checked the weather before coming out, and there had been no storms in the forecast. Yet now the wind was picking up, and the light was fading fast. This didn't look normal. Still, he tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a small pocket of bad weather, something that would pass quickly. It couldn't be anything serious. Not long after, Sean and Mary finally reached him. And just a few minutes later, the three of them stepped onto the summit together. The view was breathtaking. Endless forest stretched out in every direction. But even as they took it in, it became impossible to ignore what was happening above them. The sky had turned an ominous, almost unnatural black. Whatever system was moving in was not small, and it was not passing by. Before leaving, they decided to take a quick picture. They didn't have a tripod, and there was no easy way to get all three of them in the frame. So Mary held the camera and took a photo of her two brothers standing together at the summit. It was the best they could do. She snapped the picture. They put the camera away and prepared to start their descent. And then, without warning, everything around them exploded into blinding white light. A violent cracking sound tore through the air. Michael was thrown off his feet and slammed to the ground. Dazed and confused, he looked around, trying to understand what had just happened. He saw his sister lying on the rock. He saw his brother collapsed nearby. And then he noticed smoke rising from Sean's back. In that moment, the realization hit him. They had just been struck by lightning. Michael wasn't sure if he was badly injured, but adrenaline carried him upright. He got to his feet and realized he could still move. Mary managed to stand as well. Both of them were shaken, stunned, barely processing what had occurred. Sean, however, wasn't moving. He lay crumpled on the ground, his body still smoking. It was clear that Sean had taken the full force of the lightning strike. Michael and Mary didn't waste a second. Together, they lifted their brother and moved as fast as they could, half carrying him down the mountain. They got him into a car and sped straight to the hospital. And somehow, against all odds, Sean survived. He suffered severe burns across his body, but he lived. Michael lived. Mary lived. All three of them walked away from something that should have killed them instantly. But the reason this story is still remembered today isn't simply because they survived. Survival alone isn't what made this moment unforgettable. It's because of the photograph. The picture Mary took just moments before the lightning struck. In the image, Michael and Sean are standing on the summit, smiling. But if you look closely, something feels wrong. Their hair is standing straight up in every direction. At the time, they noticed it, but they didn't understand what it meant. They thought it was funny. That's why they're smiling. What they didn't realize was that the camera had captured something terrifying. Right before a lightning strike, especially in an exposed location like the top of a mountain, the air around you becomes electrically charged. And one of the final warning signs is your hair rising on its own. That photo froze the exact moment when they were seconds away from being struck. Today, that image is used as a warning. Park officials show it to hikers as proof of what danger looks like right before it arrives. Because if you ever find yourself on a mountain and your hair starts to stand up, you don't wait, you move. These stories are unsettling, disturbing, and hard to forget for a reason. If even one of them stayed with you, if it made you pause, think, or feel something deep inside, Don't let that moment disappear. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments, which part of this story shook you the most?